they gather in this cafe until they sense trouble, and then they emigrate. Oh, Weimar Republic, how short-lived you would be. Born 1918, died right off 1933. So come now on a journey and join me back in time. The Romansh awaits us. Our folk and culture each played a part in this. Our country was torn twixt old ways and the new heart of Berlin. Roofs looking in. They only see what they want to see. Bad hope, wars and coke, gunfire everywhere. There's fighting in the streets, warring factions until the smoke settles. Bodies in the streets. Oh, Weimar Republic, how short-lived you would be. Born 1908, died right off 1933. The countryside suspicious that Berlin is a whore and should not seize the power of the German people anymore. Here at Town's Cafe, we investigate and age. Outside Berlin, inside Berlin, what you will hear are the voices from Weimar, spoken by figures of our day, and one or two Nazis. God, what rhymes with Nazis? You get it, so sit back, turn off your cell phones, please. Everybody together. Oh, Weimar Republic, how short-lived you would be. Born 1918, right off 1933. So come with me on a journey and join me back in time. The Romansh awaits us. Now, excuse me, please. This girl needs a line. Into an opponent of war. I had already realized that it was a catastrophe for Europe, a plague on humanity, the crime of our century. For 4 years, they had fought on the Eastern Front, on the Western Front, in Asia, in Africa. For 4 years, they had stood their ground. During the war, everybody stole. Everybody sold what they had to sell, themselves included. A boy of just 14 peddled cocaine in the streets between school hours. Thoughts as to who was responsible for it had never entered my head. Now I read in these books that the imperial government had betrayed the nation, that it was just as responsible as everybody else for the war. It isn't true, I said over and over. It isn't true. But in this war, the German nation was not defending itself. I was not defending my country. We had been betrayed. Our efforts had been in vain. In the light of this revelation, my world crashed to pieces before my eyes. I had been as credulous as everybody else in Germany, as credulous as the nameless masses. Germany's needs grew ever more bitter. The bread grew still worse, the milk still thinner. The men at the front were incensed by the gormandizing and debauchery at the base and at the misery at home. They had had enough. The people thought only of peace. They had been thinking of war too long, believing in victory too long. Why hadn't they been told the truth? Why hadn't they been told when even the warlords desponded? How could the people help despairing? I felt that the land I loved had been betrayed and sold. It was for us to overthrow these betrayers. Yes, there was guilt in France, Russia, England, and Italy, but we were Germans, and we must put our own house in order first. During the night of October 3rd, 1918, the peace note was dispatched to President Wilson. This unexpected bid for peace opened the eyes of the German people at last. They had had no idea of the impending catastrophe. So, it was all for nothing. The millions of dead, the millions of wounded, the starvation at home, all for nothing. The sailors of the Kaiser's fleet were the first to revolt. 600 were arrested. The others stormed the prisons, took possession of Kiel. The dockers joined them. The German Revolution had begun. First Kiel, then Munich, Hanover, Hamburg, the Rhineland, Berlin. On November 9th, 1918, the Berlin workers left the factories and marched in thousands from the north, south, and east to the center of the city. Old gray men and women who had stood for years at munition benches, men invalided out of the army, boys who had just taken over their father's work. The processions were joined by men on leave, war widows, wounded soldiers, students, and solid citizens. No leader had arranged this uprising. The processions marched on in silence. There was no singing, no rejoicing. It came to a standstill at the gates of the Mycoffer barracks. The gates were barred, and weapons threatened from every window and loophole. Would the soldiers shoot? But the men in field gray were the brothers of these ragged, starving crowds. They flung down their weapons. The gates were opened. The people streamed in and joined forces with the Kaiser's army. The imperial standard was lowered, and the red flag fluttered in its place. From the balcony of the imperial palace, Liebknecht proclaimed the German Socialist Republic. The ruling powers gave in without a struggle. Berlin is not Germany. We in southern Germany will no longer go along with it. We want to have a nation. But now, Berlin has forfeited the right to be the capital of that nation and to represent us. It has shown itself unworthy of leading. We must draw a line between Berlin and ourselves and leave it to its quarrels and its fate. The new nation must have a new capital, not in another big city, not in a city that has completely unmasked itself, where before long the old circumstances will reign anew. No, somewhere in the heart of Germany, in a forest, on a heath, the new buildings should rise in which a better national leadership will dwell. To the spirit of Berlin, another must be opposed. The spirit of Germany. Provincial Germany, where it's most dense, lives for its disdain of Berlin and for its secret admiration. It curses Berlin when it's about politics, and it craves Berlin when it's about the Berlin for which we Berliners don't really care much. Revolution, or at least what Germans call revolution, doesn't apply to the provinces. It doesn't apply anywhere in Middle Germany, or anywhere the workers don't have the upper hand politically. No, something else rules there. The bourgeoisie rules there in its most sinister form. The old-style officer rules there. The official of the old regime rules there. And how they rule. There have been no fresh insights there. No winds of change are billowing in. Everything is the way it's always been. There, the war was lost because the traitorous homeland stabbed the noble soldiers in the back. As if the men at the front weren't Germans, the homeland's own sons. There, black, white, and red flags are still billowing in the wind. There, Wilhelm II still rules. It is both amusing and sad to see it not sinking into their brains. Revolution, change, overthrow, development? Oh yes, they're liberal. Today they call it democratic. They're liberal how they have always been liberal, and wish indeed, with measure and determination, for gradual change. Well, as long as it doesn't hit them in the wallets. They stick together like glue. Rulers almost anywhere, due to background, education, and family tradition, can't help but see class distinctions. And it has become such a part of their being that none of them, judges, local administrators, officials, none of them realize that they instinctively operate a double standard. They stick together like glue. Those form an iron wall, which is nowhere more solid than in the countryside. There have been no fresh insights there at all. Their industry is not working. Everything is the way it has always been. Where the clock is still striking 1890 and won't move forward. Class shenanigans are blossoming all over in small German towns. Every little group has their own special professional honor, and they all have their special little privileges, and they're all really something special. And below them all stands the worker. Hence the enormous loathing of Berlin. Berlin means, in some respects, that everybody is equal. That income doesn't determine one's, nor birthright, the capacity of one's character. Berlin represents the twilight of the superiors. They hate Berlin. There is no city in the world so restless as Berlin. Everything moves. The traffic lights change restlessly from red to gold and then to green. The lighted advertisements flash. The trams swing and jingle. The jaguar in the zoo paces feverishly in his cell. In the Tiergarten, the little lamps flicker among the little trees, and the grass is starred with the fireflies of 1,000 cigarettes. Trains dash through the entrails of the city and weave their way among the tiaras with which it is crowned. The jaguar in the zoo, who had really thought it was time to go to bed, rises again and paces in his cell. For in the night air, there is a throbbing sense of expectancy. Everybody knows that the next morning, no matter what happens, they will feel reborn. This physical and luminous movement finds its parallels in the dynamics of the brain. At 3 a.m., Berliners will light another cigar and embark afresh and refreshed upon discussions regarding Proust or the new penal code, or whether human shyness comes from narcissism. Berlin was getting to be more and more the center of things, and had surpassed the former art centers in Munich, Dusseldorf, and Dresden. All the leaders of modern German painting were living there. Berlin was progressive. There were marvelous theaters in Berlin, a gigantic circus, 6-day races, futurist exhibitions, beer halls the size of railroad terminals, international tango competitions, wine palaces 4 stories high. Berlin is a city with 2 centers. The cluster of expensive hotels, bars, shops, and cinemas surround the Memorial Church, and the self-conscious civic center of buildings surround the Unter den Linden, carefully arranged. In grand international styles, they assert our dignity as a capital city. Nothing has been forgotten, and they are all so very pompous, so very correct. The capital of our new German Republic was like a bubbling cauldron, only you could not see who was heating the cauldron. You could merely see it merrily bubbling, and you could feel the heat increasing. There were speakers on every street corner, and songs of hatred everywhere. Everybody was hated. The Jews, the capitalists, the gentry, the communists, the Black Reichswehr, the control commissions, the landlords, and again, the Jews. Berlin is a city with 2 centers. The cluster of expensive shops, bars, and cinemas round the Memorial Church, and the self-conscious civic center of buildings surround the Unter den Linden, carefully arranged. In grand international styles, they assert our dignity as a capital city. Nothing has been forgotten, and they are all so very pompous, so very correct. But the real heart of Berlin is in a small, damp, black wood, the Tiergarten. At this time of the year, the cold drives the peasant boys out of their unprotected cottage villages and into the city, which is its cruel heart. They go into the city to look for food and work. But the city which plains is cold and cruel and dead. It has nothing to give. It will not receive these boys. Its warmth is an illusion, a mirage of the winter desert. It will kick them out of its streets and force them into the wood, which is its cruel heart. And there they will cower on street benches to starve and freeze and dream of their faraway cottage stoves. In the doorways of buildings or on the corners of lively streets, the sausage seller sets up shop, peddling a couple of steaming sausages. Pure pork, he guarantees, for a few pennies to the wanderers of the night. And it always seems that he has such a substantial clientele. Around him gather idle prostitutes for a bit of chat. The sausage seller sells not only his sausage treats, but offers his customers the chance for other forbidden pleasures as well. For on the side, he does a booming retail trade in cocaine, the poisonous white powder. And in this connection, his clientele might well be more extensive and loyal. One has no idea how quickly the vice of cocaine has made its home in Germany. Broad groups of the population have fallen hopelessly into its clutches. One can estimate that 30% of all gamblers, prostitutes, and pederasts are cocaine users. And in other callings as well, in particular among artists, cocaine has found its loyal slaves. If supply and demand determine the price of a commodity, how strong the yearning for cocaine must be in Berlin, where before the war, a kilo of cocaine cost 16 marks. It is now offered at 17,000. That speaks volumes about cocaine addiction in our Sodom. Houses with albums of photographs and prices for women waiting on call have established themselves in Berlin. And since the provincial cities do not want to miss out on this progress, there will soon be branches in Leipzig, Hanover, and Breslau. The corrosion has set in. What am I calling the overrunning of Berlin by whores? What we all perceive, wide-eyed and every day anew, is the corruption of the bourgeois woman. The young girls from so-called good families who are turning into whores. A generation of females has grown up with nothing but the merchandising of their own physical charms in mind. They sit in parlors, of which there are a dozen new ones each week. They go to the cinemas in the evenings, and they wear skirts that end above the knees. In the theater, we might enjoy, one time, seeing a woman playing a man's role, if she is suitable for that role. But not every woman should display herself in pants or shorts, be it on stage or at sporting events. And the masculinization of the female face is detested by every real boy or man. Let us return to the old German concept of Säugtigkeit. For our ancestors, it was not the bashful girl who had no knowledge of her sex who was chaste, but the woman who consciously prepared herself to become a mother, and as a mother, to rule over a large number of children. Having children for these women was not the exercising of their right to self-determination, but fulfilling their duty to the next generation. For these women, service to the clan was still a guiding principle of their lives. These women knew about breeding, and it was their pride. They did not feel degraded to a brood mare, as is the silly suggestion voiced today by those who apparently understand the highly praised personal freedom of the female sex to mean only the freedom to taste all the joys of a bedfellow at their discretion and preferably without limit. Let us return to the best moral and traditional customs of our ancestors. They sufficed to keep German culture alive for 1.5 millennia. If in our plan to create a new nobility, marriage must include breeding, we are thereby not imposing anything animal-like or unworthy of human beings. We are merely taking the best moral and traditional customs of our ancestors and cleansing and clarifying them with the best findings and researches of modern genetics. Nudism was no longer confined to specific circles or theatrical revues and cabarets. It permeated fashion throughout society. The pretty leg was discovered and gladly put on display. Beauty aids were everywhere. Weimar women completely transformed themselves. They asserted their demands, particularly their sexual demands, much more dearly. This did cause some discrepancies and problems between the relations of the sexes as well. And as the last stage of development, there arose the female bachelor, the woman who was in charge of her own life, whether unmarried, divorced, or widowed. To all working women in countryside and in city, mothers of the proletariat and the dispossessed, come out for International Women's Day. It must become your day. Your lives and deeds are dominated by exorbitant price increases with which small and medium incomes cannot keep pace. Exorbitant prices deplete your bread and season it with the most bitter worries and scalding tears. They tear the shirts from the backs of your children and rob them of their rosy cheeks and happy smiles. Countless numbers of you are amassed in stifling back rooms, in dark, airless courtyard apartments, in musty cellars and drafty garrets. Those who still have work and earnings appear happy, but millions of unemployed men and women gather together in front of employment agencies and factory gates. That means people without bread, often the homeless too, and those without a country. Millions are no longer earning enough to salt their bread, and they live in fear that tomorrow unemployment could be their fate. Among all these countless unfortunates are countless women. As long as the men were being misused in the trenches as cannon fodder for the rich, you women were drawn into the factories by the hundreds of thousands to be used as machine fodder for scant pay, used as exalted emergency assistants in department stores, banks, offices, and schoolrooms. The democracy of the new Germany, the political equality of the female sex, will overcome this injustice, eradicate this insanity. Do you not hear this chorus daily, working women? Yes, in the new Germany, you may vote for democracy. Yes, you may even be voted for. But is not the equality of the female sex in public and in private life just on paper? 24-year-old writer Bert Brecht has changed the poetic face of Germany overnight. Brecht has brought a new tone, a new tune, a new vision to our times. Brecht has invented something he calls epic drama. Brecht's epic theater destroys any tension by announcing in advance, naively and clearly, exactly what is going to happen. According to Brecht, the most important thing is that the audience should, for heaven's sake, not get involved. Any tendency on the part of the audience to participate vicariously in the fate or the life of another must, according to Brecht, be banished. He should draw his conclusions, reject, agree, but for heaven's sake, not have any sympathies. He should observe the mechanism of an event like the mechanism of a car. There is scarcely any industry that is faster growing than the automotive industry. The young people of today already possess an educational background in automotive technology. In Germany today, there are approximately 750,000 automobiles on the streets. In just a few short years, that number will have doubled. Excuse me. The writer of our present day will necessarily take the offensive. His words will be weapons, just as much a weapon as they were 2,000 years ago at the time of Aristophanes' comedies. As much a weapon and an instrument of power as 500 years ago, when the Renaissance popes intimidated the people with paintings of Christ's descent into hell by Raphael and Michelangelo, and built St. Peter's to advertise their earthly power. A flag, a sword, a power, a weapon. Art itself cannot be taught, but craftsmanship can. Architects, sculptors, and painters are all craftsmen in the original sense of the word. It is therefore a fundamental requirement of all artistic creativity that every student undergo a thorough training in all the workshops of the branches of all the crafts. Let us establish a new guild of craftsmen without the wall of arrogance being built between artists and craftsmen. Together, let us call for, devise, and create the construction of the future, comprising all in one form: architecture, sculpture, and painting. We are living in a new age. Our image of music has also changed. What comprised a city's musical life 20 years ago? Symphony concerts, choral concerts, recitals. These were matters for the individual. Recitals were a matter of great passivity. That has now changed, just as the audience's sociological mix has changed. The working masses rising upward, wishing to participate in cultural events. Moreover, the internal structure has also changed. People no longer sit in subscription seats. They sit together in rows, wishing to form a community. Moreover, this community is no longer satisfied with simply listening. They want to make music themselves. Thus, inner involvement is guaranteed. Activity of the community replaces passivity of the individual. What is there to say about the First World War, in which I was an infantry soldier? Of a war which I never liked from the beginning, and with which I never identified? I was interested in politics, but was raised in the spirit of humanism. War then meant honor, mutilation, annihilation. Did not many wise people feel the same way? Oh yes. There was some sort of mass enthusiasm in the beginning, and it was real. But the intoxication soon blew over, and what was left was great emptiness. The flowers on the gun barrels and helmets quickly faded. There was nothing left. War then meant honor, mutilation, and annihilation. But it became filth, lice, stupor, disease, mutilation. The heroism of some of the idealists and their complete devotion to their country did exist. But these had their reverse side too. And in the end, they finally came out even. Enthusiasm is not simply a herring you can pickle, said the people. Said the people. Then, when it all bogged down in defeat, just a few years later, when everything collapsed, there was nothing left for me and many of my comrades but disgust and horror. After all, my fate had made an artist of me, not a soldier. Not a soldier. I thought the war would never end. Perhaps it never really did. Peace was proclaimed, but not everybody was drunk and happy. Fundamentally, people remained the same, with a few differences. The proud German soldier had become a beaten, weary soldier. The People's Army had fallen apart, like the ammunition pouches and uniforms made of poor ersatz material. I was not disappointed that this war was lost. I was only disappointed that nobody had listened to those few voices raised against that mass slaughter. I went back to live in Berlin. The city looked like a gray corpse made of stone. There were cracks in all the walls. Plaster and paint were crumbling. The dead, dirty, hollow windows seemed still to mourn those many for whom they had looked in vain. I went back to my apartment, in my studio, and drew. I drew wine drinkers, beer drinkers, gin drinkers, a murderer sitting on a packing case with the murdered woman's body inside. I drew wine drinkers, beer drinkers, gin drinkers, and a worried man washing his blood-stained hands. I drew soldiers in action, using my sketchbooks from the war, and lonely little men running crazily through empty streets in flight from unknown horrors. Every product of disgust capable of becoming a negation of the family is Dada. Protests with the fists of its whole being engaged in destructive action. Dada. Knowledge of all of the means rejected up until now by the shame-faced sex of comfortable compromise and good manners. Dada. Abolition of logic, which is the dance of those impotent to create. Dada. Of every social hierarchy and equation set up for us by the sake of our values by our valets. Dada. Abolition of memory. Dada. Abolition of archaeology. Dada. Abolition of prophets. Dada. Abolition of the future. Dada. The absolute and unquestionable faith in every God that is the product of spontaneity, freedom. Dada. 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 The roaring of tense colors and interlacing of opposites, and of all grotesques, inconsistencies, contradictions, life. We Dadaists had meetings. We used the English word in which, for a small admissions fee, we did nothing but tell people the truth. That is, insulted them. We spoke without inhibition, using plenty of four-letter words. We would say, "You old heap of shit over there? I mean you stupid ass. Don't you laugh, you moron. Shut up or I'll give you an assful." And so on, and so on. The German Dada movement was rooted in the realization which came simultaneously to many of my comrades and myself, that it was complete insanity to believe that spirit, or people of spirit, ruled the world. Dada was the first significant art movement in Germany in decades. Don't laugh. Through this movement, all the isms of art became yesterday's inconsequential studio affairs. Dada forced the devotees of art to show their true colors. Dada was not a made movement, but an organic product resulting in reaction to the head in the clouds tendencies of so-called holy art, whose disciples brooded over cubes and Gothic art, while the generals were painting in blood. Our only mistake was to have seriously engaged at all with so-called art. Dada was the breakthrough, originating in a narrow, overbearing, and overrated milieu. It floated in the air between the classes and knew no responsibility to the general public. If I have become skeptical about progress, it is because of the experiences of my lifetime. Mine was a time when the sweetest declarations of the brotherhood of man were voiced. At the same time that the bloodiest wars in the history of our planet were being fought, solace and suicide in grand style. Post-war Berlin, noise, shouting, rumors, political slogans. What will happen next? It was a completely negative world, with gaily colored froth on top that many people mistook for the true, the happy Germany before the eruption of the new barbarism. Foreigners who visited us during that time were easily fooled by the light-hearted, whirring fun on the surface, by the nightlife and so-called freedom and flowering of the arts. But that was really nothing more than froth. Below the surface of the shimmering swamp lay fratricide and general discord, and regiments were formed for the final reckoning. People had been used to marching for years, so they simply went on marching, be it less straight, less smartly than before. People had been used to receiving orders, but now nobody gave orders. Yet, they went on marching because they knew they must fall into line. But what they missed was the sharp voice of command. The radical press has printed a stream of jokes, digs, and accusations directed at Captain Rom, an employee of the Hitler movement. Now, you should never accept any of the titles dished out by the Nazis, just as you should never accept any of the categories proclaimed by Hitler. So many Germans succumb to such silly suggestions and approach these things as if they were schoolwork assigned by Hitler. We are not in school, and these titles, commendations, and reprimands from this house painter, they don't mean a thing to us. So, Rome is gay. I think these attacks on the man miss the point. Any means are good means when used against Hitler and his people. Those who treat others without mercy are not entitled to receive mercy, stick it to them. In the same regard, I would not shy away from the personal lives of those involved either. Stick it good. But this goes too far. For all our sakes, it goes too far. First of all, you should not look for your opponent in bed. Any of these things might be accepted. Pointing out the Nazis' excesses, in which they talk about the oriental vices of post-war Germany, as if lesbianism, homosexuality, and the like were something invented by the Russians, who imposed them on the pure, untainted, noble German people. If a Nazi says something like this, then and only then can you say you have homosexuals in your own movement who are proud of their orientation and are completely open about it. So shut up. Jokes about Rome just don't sit right with me. The man's orientation does not disqualify him at all. Has Rome committed some sort of public offense? No. Has he pushed himself on young boys? No. Has he intentionally spread venereal diseases? No. These things are subject to public criticism. Anything else is his business. There is a reluctance to speak about the fact of homosexuality. Understanding it requires serious consideration. That means intellectual exertion. So, some plead that the topic is just not respectable enough for them. Understanding homosexuality presupposes a psychological reorientation of the brain, a self-liberation from the tutelage of a legislator who ignorantly subsumes homosexuality and depravity under the same concept. A fact discovered by embryological science of the previous century: unisexuality is a later development prior or subsequent to an original bisexuality. This is to be observed in plants as well as in animals such as snails. It is therefore a fact that homosexuality is a natural, inborn condition that is a matter of constitution. If one carries this thought process through to the conclusion that homosexuality is a natural, inborn disposition, then one can only regard the moral condemnation of homosexuality as an injustice. War is romantic. No one has ever denied the mystic or poetic elements residing in it. But today, only the insensible would deny that it is utterly debased romanticism, an utter distortion of the poetic. The side of peace is the side of culture, art, and thought, whereas in a war, vulgarity triumphs. War reveals itself as the triumph of all that is brutal and vulgar in the soul of our race, as the arch foe of culture and thought, and as the blood orgy of egoism, corruption, and violence. Why do we oppose the Jews? We are enemies of the Jews because we are fighters for the freedom of the German people. The Jew is responsible for our misery, and he lives on it. The Jew has used the broad difficulties of the broad masses of our people to deepen the unholy split between right and left among our people. He has made two halves of Germany. He is the real cause of our loss in the Great War. The Jew has no interest in the solution of Germany's fateful problems. He cannot have any, for he lives on the fact that there has been no solution. He is responsible for our misery. He lives on it. The Jew is the cause and the beneficiary of our misery. The Jew has the best trumps in his hands when a people lives in an inner and outer slavery. That is why we, as nationalists and as socialists, oppose the Jew. He has corrupted our race, fouled our morals, undermined our customs, and broken our power. The Jew is the plastic demon of the decline of mankind. The reason that people are beginning to follow Hitler is that they have not overcome the war. It continues to rule them, and in their minds has never ended. They live in a permanent state of war. On the psychological side, the two most important phenomena of culture are firstly, a strengthening of the intellect, which seems to master our instinctive life, and secondly, an introversion of the aggressive impulse, with all its consequent benefits and perils. Now, war today runs most emphatically counter to the psychic disposition imposed on us by the growth of culture. We are therefore bound to resent war, to find it utterly intolerable. So why do we, you and I, and many another, protest so vehemently against war, instead of just accepting it as another of life's odious importunities, when it seems a natural thing enough, biologically sound, and practically unavoidable? Adolf Hitler, whose party gained ground during the last years or two, had planned a putsch with Ludendorff for November 2nd. In a Munich beer cellar, Hitler proclaimed the government overthrown and declared himself dictator. In the night, he had a number of Jewish citizens arrested, announced a march on Berlin, and swore that on the morrow he would either conquer or die. The next day, when the procession was marching with Ludendorff and Hitler at its head, they found their way blocked by a detachment of the Reichswehr. The army opened fire, and several National Socialists were killed. Hitler and Ludendorff flung themselves on the ground, a feat for which nobody could blame them, and retreated at the earliest possible moment. Hitler was accused of high treason, but it was obvious that the Republican judges sympathized with him. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a term of imprisonment which did not include the sentence due to him for breaking the peace. Conflicts of interest between people are resolved in principle by recourse to violence. It is the same in the animal kingdom, from which humanity cannot claim exclusion. Nevertheless, people are also prone to conflicts of opinion, touching, on occasion, the loftiest peaks of abstract thought, which seem to call for settlement by quite another method. War today is dishonorable. It does not have the honor it once did. And given the high perfection of modern arms, war today would mean the sheer extermination of one of the combatants, if not of both. We can but wonder why the conduct of war is not banned by general consent. When the war between the wild animals and wild birds came to an end, and the domestic animals, who had fought on the side of the wild ones as in previous times, were once again persecuted by the wild ones, the domestic animals eventually lost their patience. So one day, the domestic animals rebelled with great animosity, and they told the lion and all of his constituents, who had represented all the wild animals in the animal kingdom, to go to the devil. A great council of domestic animals was elected in order to take care of the government in the animal kingdom. The lion who had ruled as king until then was banished to a distant cave. However, since domestic animals tend to be sentimental, they told the horses, former subjects of the lion, to bring the banished king something to eat each day. They felt it was just not right to let a banished king starve. Then they attempted to restore everything to its right place. It was an old custom in the animal kingdom to celebrate a day of justice once a year. The wolves served as judges and the jackals as prosecutors. The young among the domestic animals demanded that the important posts of judge and prosecutor be placed in the hands of the domestic animals. But the old sheep, oxen, and donkeys argued for maintaining the traditional forms, and they especially did not want to go against the constitutional principle regarding the immutability of the wolves. Moreover, the old domestic animals said that the sheep, oxen, and donkeys could never hold these important posts because the sheep, oxen, and donkeys could never be anything but domestic animals. The old sheep, oxen, and donkeys pushed through their position, and the wolves remained judges, and the jackals remained prosecutors. As the day of justice approached, the wolves planned a secret conspiracy with the jackals and other wild animals against the domestic animals, who arrived unsuspectingly in large hordes, proud of their newly won power. As the last donkey came into the place of justice, the jackals accused all the domestic animals of high treason, and the wolves came to a quick decision. The domestic animals were to serve as food for the wild ones. Before they could even grasp what was actually happening, the domestic animals were being torn to pieces by the wild ones and eaten. Then the lion returned in triumph to his throne in the animal kingdom. Of course, the wolves were given high titles and decorated with medals. And when all of this is over, when all has run its course, this mass delusion, this delight in banding into hordes, yelling in hordes, waving flags in groups, when the modern mania for turning human baseness into goodness by lying has ended, and all the fights against fascism are over, and the last libertarian emigrants have passed away, then it will again become very modern to be a liberal. Someday, someone will come along with a thundering discovery. He will discover the individual. He will say, there is an organism called man, and he is the important thing, and the goal is his freedom. Groups are something secondary. The state is something secondary. the man who will say these things will make a big splash. People will hail his words as doctrine. They will say, "Why, we've never heard anything like this before. What courage! A new epic of humanity is dawning. What a genius we have living among us! Forward!" And then this will have an effect. And 1,000 black, red, and brown shirts will be thrown into a corner and on a rubbish heap. People will gain the courage of their convictions again without majority decisions or fear of a state which made them shut up like whipped dogs. And this is the way things will be until one day